All right, so for this week, we're going to go through some slides. And as we go through the slides, you're going to fill in the blanks on this document. Okay. So these are the slides. They're sitting out there. All right. So now we're doing genetics. And I love genetics. It's really fun. This first slide, let's see, is it view? I want to start the slideshow. Maybe present. All right, so we all should know this first picture is the DNA helix that we were talking about in the last unit. And so our DNA has all the genetic information embedded in it. Here's a tortoiseshell cat. That's a genetic characteristic. Here is a tall man and a short man. That is built into your genetics. This is an albino alligator. Again, that's a genetic condition. And this is, I've seen one person with this ability to like make a flower with their tongue. Of course, rolling your tongue is also another feature that you can do. So, genetics is the science that studies how genes are transmitted from one generation to the next. And here is corn, another genetic thing, and this is called a hitchhiker's thumb. It is also a genetic ability. If you have this type of thumb, it's passed on through your genes. So, genes and chromosomes. Chromosomes are contained in the nucleus and they're made of DNA. And a gene is a segment of that DNA with a trait, a hereditary trait. So a chromosome is a long chain of genes. Oops. And this picture right here is different chromosomes that are paired up here. All right, are you good? So a trait would be hair color, eye color, tall, short, skin color are all traits. So you have to have two Eli's in order for a trait to show up. One must come from your mom, and the other comes from your dad. When fertilization occurs, the new offspring will have two Eli's for every trait. right, so this is Gregor Mendel. He is the father of genetics. He was an Austrian monk who was born in 1822, and he discovered three laws of genetics that this changed biology forever. And he did all of this in a garden with pea plants. So the three basic laws are the laws of dominance and recessiveness, which we're going to learn about, the principle of segregation, and the principle of independent assortment. So Mendel's great contribution was that he demonstrated that these characteristics are inherited from the parents and carried by the genes. So he used peas. And why did he use peas? Because they were readily available, they're easy to grow, and they grow fast. And the sexual structure of the flower are completely enclosed, so there'd be no accidental cross pollination. Do you know what cross pollination is? So say I have pink flowers next to green flowers, even though we don't have green, but just to have. So the pollen, as you might be aware, is really like the sperm of plants. So cross pollination is when the green flower pollen might get into the pink flower pollen, and then we'd come out with, I don't know, a blue flower. So the way the flowers are on peas, another variety of pea cannot intermix unless it's done on purpose. You with me? Ever seen um sometimes, biologists will use a paintbrush and brush the pollen onto, the paintbrush, and then transfer it to whatever plant they want to cross pollinate. So they want to mix two different plants. And that's how they do it. Now, are you with me a little bit more? Okay. All right. So, yeah, here's the basic sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So, flowers contain both male and female reproduction structures. So, the pistil produces egg cells, and that's what's in the back. So, you'll never look at a flower the same after this lesson. There it is. And the male, the stamen, is what produces pollen that contains the sperm cells. So there they are, the stamen. So when the pollen is delivered, uh, it becomes fertilized. And that's the inside of an embryo of a seed. Everything's in there. All right, so Mendel's use of pea plants for genetics. Pea plants are normally self pollinating, which means, you don't have to do anything, they pollinate themselves. Because both structures are inside that flower. And so every single plant is going to be a copy of whatever, plant is there, or its parent. All right. So Mendel knew that these pea plants, he said, true breeding, and it allowed them to produce identical offspring. So, if allowed to self pollinate, tall plants would always have tall plants. Plants with yellow seeds would always produce yellow seeds. And this was the cornerstone of his experiments. So, what did he do different? So, he wanted to produce seeds from two different plants. And so, first, he had to prevent that self pollination. And there's the paintbrush with the pollen in a pea plant. So, he cut away the stamens, the male part, and dusted the remaining female structure with pollen from a different plant. So, as I said, this is cross pollination, and it produces offspring from two different parents. So, Mendel could easily crossbreed and experiment with different characteristics. So, remember characteristics: tall, short, green, yellow, etc. So, here's another characteristic. Which sum, if you were going to fold your hands, which sum goes on top? I know. Ah, see, and I'm right. So uh, that is genetics. So a couple terms. P generation is parental generation. F1 is your first generation of offspring. F2 is second generation. And hybrids, offspring of the parents with different traits. So Mendel Cross, his first experiment was tall versus dwarf. And what happened? So when he crossed these two, all tall offspring appeared. Everybody was tall. And so the F1 hybrids, the first generation, were all tall. All the offspring had the appearance of only one of the parents. The trait of the other parent seemed to disappear. And Mendel thought that let me hide that. Oops, go back. Thought that the dwarf trait had disappeared. So biological inheritance is determined by factors that are passed from one generation to the next. Today we know it's the genes. And each trait Mendel observed was controlled by one gene that appears in two contrasting forms. So the gene for the height occurs in a tall form and in dwarf form. And so we call these Eli's. Anyway, so Mendel realized that some Eli's are dominant over other Eli's. So that's where he got his principle of dominance and recessiveness. So some Eli's are dominant and others are recessive. a dominant Eli covers up or masks a recessive Eli. If the dominant Eli is present, it will show up in the offspring. And the recessive trait will only show up if the dominant Eli is not present. So Mendel had another question. Had the dwarf trait disappeared, or was it still present in that first offspring? So he allowed these hybrid, which means, they were manipulated by offspring from the first generation to self pollinate. So we have F1 tall and F1 tall. And so here's a little diagram. The parents were tall and short. All the children from the first generation came out tall. And lo and behold, the second generation had 3/4 tall and one dwarf plant. So that dwarf had not disappeared, it was still there. So the trait had been hidden from everybody. And so the dwarf trait is still passed down and it reappears in the second generation. Are you with me? Am I getting too confusing? Okay. What time is it? It's almost time to go. So, why did the recessive Eli seem to disappear? Well, he realized that organisms have two Elis and they're inherited one from each parent. And if the offspring receives a dominant Eli from one, that dominant trait will appear. And recessive traits will not show up, but they're still there. And we're going to learn how to tell. So, if a parent has two Elis, let's stop here. Let us stop here and we will continue tomorrow. And let me. Got too much up here. I don't see. There it is.